In the pre-dawn hours of February 24, 2022, the world awoke to the rumble of tanks and the thunder of missiles striking across a European border. Russia, underestimating both the resolve and capability of its neighbor, had launched what it believed would be a swift, decisive operation. 4 months, intelligence reports had suggested that the Ukrainian state was fragile, politically divided, and unprepared to face a full-scale invasion. Leaders in Moscow assumed that Kyiv would collapse under pressure, that political elites would surrender, and that ordinary citizens would retreat rather than resist. The plan, in essence, was predicated on overconfidence, hubris, and an assumption that history itself was on Russia's side. Yet, war has a way of punishing arrogance. Within the first few hours, Russian forces encountered something they had not accounted for. A population ready to fight, armed not just with weapons, but with determination. Entire towns rose to resist, and Ukrainian soldiers, well prepared and disciplined, countered movements that Moscow had assumed would be uncontested. Russian airborne units, intended to secure key government buildings and paralyze the command structure, found themselves isolated, facing well-trained defenders who had anticipated such strikes. One elite unit parachuted near an airfield, expecting to walk into a surrendering city, but what awaited them was an ambush that would leave both soldiers and strategists questioning their assumptions. As the sun climbed higher, columns of armored vehicles crept toward Kyiv, along wide, open highways. Commanders believed that speed was the ultimate weapon. The faster they advanced, the quicker the government would capitulate. Yet the defenders had laid traps, improvised barricades, and prepared anti-tank positions along choke points. Convoys stretched for tens of kilometers, vulnerable to precision strikes. Russian generals assumed logistical support would be simple. Instead, fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and poorly coordinated reinforcements created confusion on the battlefield. Roads became graveyards for armored vehicles, and soldiers found themselves stranded in cold, exposed fields, while artillery fire rained down from unseen positions. The assumption of easy victory evaporated almost immediately. Russia had relied heavily on political security forces to achieve the quick decapitation of Ukraine's leadership. Conventional forces were expected to support and exploit the rapid success of these units. Yet when the political strike faltered, there was no plan B. Moscow's strategists had designed a war that could not fail. So they thought. As soldiers advanced into the outskirts of Kyiv, they faced not surrender but a resilient, adaptive defense that repeatedly countered every maneuver. With communication lines disrupted and orders delayed or ignored, some units lost cohesion entirely. The very assumption that overconfidence could substitute for planning now threatened to undo the entire operation. Meanwhile, civilians did not flee. They became part of the defense. Volunteers dug trenches, supplied frontline units, and coordinated intelligence with the military. Ordinary citizens armed with small arms and Molotov cocktails became a constant hazard to Russian patrols. What Moscow had anticipated would be a quick political victory transformed into a complex urban struggle, with defenders exploiting knowledge of terrain, infrastructure, and population networks. Every step forward demanded enormous effort and produced devastating losses. By the second day, the scale of misjudgment became glaring. Strategic miscalculations that seemed minor on paper, assumptions about morale, over-reliance on speed, underestimating supply chain complexity now threatened the operational integrity of entire army groups. Russian forces, expecting Kyiv to fall within hours, were now confronted by a city alive with resistance. The anticipated decisive victory had evaporated, replaced with uncertainty, confusion, and mounting casualties. Commanders on the ground began improvising. But improvisation at this scale is rarely sufficient when the entire strategy is flawed from the outset. Please, if you are enjoying this deep dive into the early hours of one of the most consequential European conflicts of the 21st century, click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps more people see this story and understand how strategy, hubris, and preparation collide in real warfare. As the Russian columns inched forward, satellite imagery revealed what the Kremlin had failed to notice. Ukrainian units were rotating continuously, reinforcing vulnerable sectors and exploiting every weakness in the Russian advance. Logistics trucks became targets, supply convoys stalled, and morale began to falter among units that had expected an easy march to Kyiv. The invader had assumed mastery of the skies, But dispersed anti-air defenses, mobile artillery, and drones quickly turned air superiority into a contested domain. What should have been an unstoppable advance was becoming a slow, grinding march under constant threat. Even the airfields, once thought secure, became scenes of unexpected resistance. Paratroopers landed not to find capitulation, but to confront prepared, well-coordinated defense teams. Small units held intersections, bridges, and key infrastructure, forcing Russian commanders to divert forces in ways that the original plan never accounted for. Supplies dwindled faster than predicted, and morale began to fracture. Moscow's overconfidence collided violently with the reality of a nation determined to defend its independence. And yet, while disaster loomed, the initial stages of the invasion had only begun. The full consequences of these miscalculations, entire cities on fire, convoys under siege, and the fragile cohesion of Russian forces tested would unfold over the coming days in ways that would reshape both nations forever. In the shadows of Kyiv, a pivotal moment was forming, one that would force the invader to confront a question that no amount of planning had anticipated. Could rapid victory ever be achieved against a nation unwilling to surrender? Across the border, Ukrainian forces braced themselves for an attack that intelligence had long predicted but few outside military circles fully understood. Years of modernization, reform, and integration with Western support had transformed a once under-prepared army into a force capable of rapid mobilization and effective resistance. Veterans trained in previous conflicts provided a backbone of experience, guiding newly recruited soldiers through the chaos of a high-intensity war. Units were dispersed strategically, fortified with the latest anti-tank and anti-air systems, and prepared for both conventional and unconventional tactics. Yet the scale of the impending assault, massive armored columns, airborne assaults, and missile strikes was enough to test even the most well-prepared defenders. As the first waves of Russian missiles and bombs struck, targeting command centers, communication hubs, and military depots, Ukrainian forces had already dispersed key assets. Leadership had anticipated the attempts to decapitate their government and military command, relocating personnel, diversifying communication networks, and integrating intelligence from Western allies. This preparation meant that while strikes were destructive, they did not paralyze the nation's military apparatus. Soldiers, civilians, and volunteers coordinated seamlessly, responding to threats with a precision that belied the chaos of bombardment. The invaders' expectations of rapid collapse met the first real obstacle: an organized, adaptive defense that would not yield to intimidation or firepower alone. In the north, around Kyiv, small tactical units transformed residential streets and industrial zones into defensive networks. Barricades, improvised minefields, and sniper positions slowed armored columns to a crawl. Russian units, expecting quick passage, found themselves navigating deadly corridors where every intersection, every bridge, every overpass could conceal a trap. Ukrainian engineers had mined roads and set up observation posts that allowed artillery to strike precisely when enemy vehicles were exposed. The invaders' numerical superiority was constantly blunted by innovation, patience, and local knowledge. And yet, the situation remained fluid. In the south, around Kherson and Mariupol, Russian forces initially made gains, seizing towns and attempting to establish supply lines. But here, too, defenders displayed resilience. Local militias, combined with army units, harassed logistics convoys, striking bridges and key choke points to disrupt the advance. Supply shortages forced the invaders to stretch thin, making their forces vulnerable to ambushes and counterattacks. What had been anticipated as a straightforward push quickly became a war of attrition, where every kilometer gained demanded a disproportionately high cost in men, material, and morale. Ukrainian command and control demonstrated remarkable flexibility. When airfields were threatened, aircraft were dispersed to alternate locations. When artillery positions were targeted, mobile units relocated, firing in new directions before withdrawing to safety. Electronic warfare and drones provided real-time intelligence, allowing commanders to exploit weaknesses in Russian formations. The defenders had prepared for decades of lessons learned from both their own history and contemporary conflicts elsewhere in the world. It was a calculated gamble, but one that paid off almost immediately when the first Russian armored thrusts slowed to a crawl under constant, coordinated attacks. Despite the intensity of the invasion, civilians played a vital role. Citizens organized local defense groups, provided intelligence on enemy movements, and assisted in evacuating those in danger. Improvised networks distributed food, medical aid, and ammunition to frontline units, allowing soldiers to maintain effectiveness under extreme pressure. The population's determination not to yield transformed the battlefield itself. No street was merely a street. No town merely a collection of buildings. It became an extension of the defender's strategy. Russian commanders had assumed an apathetic or compliant civilian population. They were wrong. Meanwhile, morale among Ukrainian troops was remarkably high. Veterans rotated with new recruits, ensuring that the inexperienced were never exposed without guidance. Units practiced combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, artillery, and armored elements with astonishing efficiency. The defenders' adaptability was particularly evident when confronting mechanized Russian columns along narrow highways. Anti-tank teams struck from concealed positions, then melted back into the landscape before counter-battery fire could respond. Ukrainian intelligence constantly fed commandos data on enemy weaknesses, allowing precise targeting that multiplied the effect of every defensive effort. The invaders' initial momentum faltered. High-speed armored advances were transformed into slow, dangerous maneuvers. Russian planners had assumed an enemy that would crumble under the shock of assault. Instead, they faced a nation ready to exploit every misstep. Every stalled convoy, every ambushed unit, and every counterattack reinforced the growing sense among Russian commanders that their initial assumptions were catastrophically flawed. The defenders' discipline, preparedness, and ingenuity were turning what was expected to be a brief campaign into a prolonged, costly engagement. And as Ukrainian units prepared for the next phase counterattacks that could exploit vulnerabilities in stretched Russian formations, a larger question loomed. Could the invaders recover from such a catastrophic miscalculation, or had the defenders permanently seized the initiative? The coming days would determine not only the fate of cities like Kyiv and Mariupol, but also the strategic trajectory of a war that was rapidly diverging from the invaders' original plan. By the end of the first week, it was clear that Ukraine's preparation had fundamentally reshaped the battlefield. Russian forces, frustrated, exhausted, and under constant threat, were now forced to reconsider strategy, while Ukrainian defenders, bolstered by early successes and public support, readied themselves for the challenges yet to come. The stage was set for intense urban engagements, high-stakes counteroffensives, and a protracted struggle that would test both sides in unprecedented ways. Even as the defenders held, the question persisted. How far could they push back the invading forces, and at what cost? Every city defended, every convoy stalled, and every tactical victory carried the shadow of the enormous human and material toll that modern warfare demanded. The story of preparation, resilience, and ingenuity was only just beginning, and the lessons of these early battles would reverberate through the rest of the conflict in ways few could have imagined. As the morning mist cleared over Kyiv and other key Ukrainian cities, the invasion entered a phase neither side had fully anticipated. The initial shock of bombardment had passed, but now, streets, bridges, and highways became deadly theaters of urban combat. Russian armored columns, intended to advance with overwhelming speed, found themselves funneled into narrow corridors where anti-tank teams, drones, and ambushes turned every movement into a gamble with life itself. Ukrainian forces, fortified and adaptive, had transformed the environment into a trap. Every checkpoint, every building, and even open fields were potential kill zones, each amplifying the defenders' tactical advantage. Yet the invaders pressed on, believing that sheer force and numerical superiority could compensate for poor planning and stretched supply lines. Mechanized units moved in long, exposed convoys, while commanders struggled to maintain communication under relentless drone surveillance and artillery fire. Russian logistics faltered, fuel and ammunition dwindled, and soldiers on the ground faced exhaustion and confusion. What Moscow had envisioned as a decisive, rapid campaign had instead become a slow grind against a determined and mobile opponent. And in one northern suburb, an armored column moving to flank the city's defenses was suddenly halted by a coordinated counterattack that would leave dozens of vehicles destroyed, the soldiers trapped, and command officers scrambling for alternatives. Ukrainian forces exploited every weakness. Small, mobile units struck supply convoys, then disappeared into the cityscape, leaving invaders vulnerable to repeated attacks. Mortared teams and sniper squads created uncertainty and fear within the enemy ranks, while precision artillery and drone-guided strikes systematically dismantled critical logistics nodes. The Russian assumption that speed and surprise could substitute for careful planning was proving catastrophic. Urban terrain, civilians, and improvised defenses neutralized advantages in numbers and heavy armor. It was in the south, around Mariupol, that the stakes became even more apparent. Russian units, intent on seizing key ports and transport hubs, encountered a city prepared to resist at all costs. Ukrainian defenders, including local militias and reorganized army units, fortified residential buildings, industrial complexes, and public squares. Artillery fire rained down from concealed positions, while snipers and anti-tank teams targeted every exposed vehicle. Russian forces quickly realized that capturing Mariupol would not be a matter of a swift push, but a brutal, protracted engagement that would drain manpower, resources, and morale. Please, if you are finding this deep dive into the intensity of these pivotal battles engaging, click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps more people discover this story and understand how tactical decisions and adaptability shape the course of modern warfare. Meanwhile, northern assaults on Kyiv faced unexpected chaos. Russian airborne units attempting to seize key administrative buildings were met with well-coordinated resistance. Ukrainian intelligence had anticipated likely drop zones and reinforced them with both military units and civilian volunteers. Every street became a battlefield, every intersection a potential ambush. Communications breakdowns and slow reinforcement compounded the invaders' difficulties, leaving units isolated and vulnerable. What had been expected to be a rapid seizure of the capital was evolving into a deadly chessboard, with defenders dictating terms at every turn. Long supply lines stretched the Russian advance thin. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and constant harassment from mobile Ukrainian units created paralysis in key sectors. Convoys intended to sustain the offensive became prime targets, while communication failures left commanders unable to coordinate effectively. At one point, a 64-kilometer-long convoy, intended to resupply northern forces, became immobilized, vulnerable to repeated artillery strikes and drone attacks. Soldiers reported being trapped in freezing conditions, surrounded by unrelenting fire, and facing the realization that strategic assumptions had failed entirely. As urban combat intensified, improvised defenses became the norm. Civilians reinforced barricades, engineers constructed anti-tank ditches, and volunteers supplied critical intelligence to frontline units. Ukrainian soldiers moved fluidly between positions, conducting ambushes and striking with precision before withdrawing to safety. The invaders' reliance on rapid, overwhelming assault had collided with a nation that had anticipated every likely move and prepared countermeasures in advance. Every advance was costly, and every step forward highlighted the gap between Moscow's planning and battlefield reality. In Kyiv, the defenders' use of intelligence and technology reshaped engagements. Drones provided real-time reconnaissance, identifying Russian weak points, artillery positions, and mechanized formations. Commanders adapted swiftly, reinforcing sectors under threat and exploiting exposed enemy units. Even elite Russian forces, trained for rapid strikes and urban engagement, found themselves repeatedly ambushed and out. Each failed maneuver not only cost vehicles and manpower, but eroded confidence, creating a cascading effect that slowed the invasion and left Moscow scrambling for solutions. By early March 2022, it was clear that the Russian assumption of rapid victory had collapsed entirely. Initial plans had relied on swift decapitation of the Ukrainian government, fast armored thrusts, and overwhelming shock. Instead, the invader faced a reality they were unprepared for. Urban centers transformed into fortresses, civilians acting as auxiliaries to the military, and a well-coordinated defense exploiting every misstep. What had been designed as a political strike had evolved into a grinding, attritional conflict that would reshape not only Ukraine but the global understanding of modern warfare. In Kyiv and surrounding areas, Russian columns were stalled, supply lines crippled, and morale fragile. Even elite units, trained for rapid deployment and decisive action, found themselves bogged down in prolonged urban engagements. Ukrainian forces used every available asset: drones, precision artillery, mobile infantry, and civilian intelligence networks to identify weaknesses and deliver targeted strikes. Each day of resistance eroded the invaders' advantage, while defenders leveraged familiarity with terrain, local infrastructure, and tactical ingenuity to multiply the effect of their smaller numbers. In the suit, Mariupol became a symbol of the shift from blitz to stalemate. Russian forces, expecting to capture the city within days, found themselves engaged in a brutal, protracted fight that inflicted heavy losses. Civilian populations, unwilling to flee, created logistical challenges for attackers, while defenders repurposed urban infrastructure for tactical advantage. Hospitals, factories, and apartment complexes became defensive positions, forcing invaders to commit disproportionate firepower to secure incremental gains. The cost was staggering, both in human life and material, and yet Ukrainian forces held firm. Meanwhile, the wider operational picture revealed the consequences of flawed planning. Russian units, forced to adapt to prolonged engagement, began conscripting reserves, redeploying poorly trained units, and relying increasingly on heavy artillery and indiscriminate bombardment. The original doctrine, speed, precision, and shock was replaced by attrition warfare, as frontline commanders struggled to maintain cohesion. Every stalled advance and failed encirclement amplified the psychological toll on soldiers, further undermining morale. Even as the invader attempted to shift strategy, Ukrainian forces exploited the opportunity. Counterattacks along vulnerable supply lines, targeted strikes on bridges and roads, and ambushes against mechanized units created operational paralysis. Cities that were meant to fall quickly became fortified bastions, turning what should have been short campaigns into long-term battles of endurance. The defenders' ability to adapt, improvise, and maintain coordination highlighted the human element in warfare. Morale, determination, and resilience could defy even the most formidable machinery. The international response further bolstered Ukraine's position. Western nations provided intelligence, precision munitions, and logistical support, creating a force multiplier that the invader had not anticipated. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the mobilization of external aid forced Russian planners to allocate resources to counter external pressure, stretching an already overextended campaign. The combination of domestic resilience and international support created a strategic environment in which the initial objectives were no longer feasible. And yet, the war dragged on. Urban centers became arenas of devastation. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, and supply chains strained under continuous pressure. Russian forces, lacking both foresight and preparation for sustained conflict, struggled to maintain momentum. Ukrainian forces, though victorious in delaying and repelling attacks, faced immense challenges in protecting civilians, maintaining supply lines, and holding extended front lines. The transformation from a calculated political strike into a protracted war of attrition was now complete. Every failed assault underscored a key principle of modern warfare. Rapid victories require more than numbers and firepower. They demand flexibility, local knowledge, and an understanding of human will. Russian forces, encountering resistance they had neither anticipated nor prepared for, had to rethink doctrine in real time, while Ukrainian forces capitalized on every miscalculation. Commanders on both sides learned, adapted, and improvised under extreme pressure, demonstrating that the battlefield was as much a test of intellect and planning as of weaponry and manpower. By mid-2022, the war had entered a stalemate in many sectors. Kyiv remained secure, Mariupol was contested, and other regions saw intermittent advances and retreats. Russian forces retained firepower superiority, but lacked the capacity to decisively change outcomes. Ukrainian forces, while stretched, had learned to turn disadvantages into advantages, demonstrating that effective preparation and resilience could offset overwhelming odds. The conflict had become a study in contrast. The invaders' flawed assumptions versus the defenders' adaptability, arrogance versus determination, and planning versus improvisation. The consequences of this shift were profound. What had been intended as a short, politically decisive operation evolved into a drawn-out war with strategic, economic, and humanitarian implications. Entire cities were devastated, civilian populations traumatized, and global geopolitics altered. Yet, the defenders remained resolute. The human spirit, organization, and tactical ingenuity of Ukraine's military and civilian population turned the tide against what had seemed an unstoppable force. And as the world watched, it became clear that modern warfare was not merely about speed or numbers, it was about the ability to endure, adapt, and resist. The invasion, intended to be a swift triumph, had transformed into a cautionary tale for strategists everywhere. The assumption that any nation can be rapidly subdued ignores the most unpredictable and decisive element of all its people. The story of the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, from expectation to harsh reality, stands as a modern testament to the principles of warfare. Preparation matters, flexibility is essential, and resilience can redefine the balance of power. While the conflict continues to evolve, the early months of the war remain a stark illustration of how hubris, underestimation, and flawed planning can derail even the most powerful military machine, leaving an enduring lesson for history, strategy, and humanity itself.